Hello and welcome to this Chess Club game review. It's a game I played recently at the local chess club, and both of us, myself and my opponent, we both reached the 97% accuracy rating. So I don't know, I was kind of surprised. Let's take a look at the game. We'll just see how it went here. So I played Frank, and let's see. He had the white pieces. He begins with d4, and I respond with d5. And now we have c4, the Queen's Gambit, which is a good opening to play for a solid game, strategic play. A little bit less tactics than possibly e4 openings. So here, I've been working on how to respond to the Queen's Gambit. I decide on the Slav defense, where you push the c pawn. If they capture, you can recapture and keep the pawns even in the center. So my opponent, he just develops a knight, and here it looks like the best move would be to go ahead and develop a knight as well. But I didn't want to have to worry about his bishop attacking. So I decided to push the pawn, to h6. And I don't know if that was the best move. It says it's still a good move, but we notice how now it's a zero point 0.5 advantage, almost half a pawn equivalent advantage for white. So my opponent does likewise here, which kind of dissipates his advantage a little bit. Apparently he should have played maybe e3, but he probably didn't want to block in his bishop. So I continue with my plan of developing the knight, not having to worry about the bishop attacking it now. And so here, computer recommends c takes d5, and then I should capture back, like I said, keeping pawns even in the middle. Game continues with another knight developing, and I bring my bishop outside of the pawn chain because I plan to push my other pawn to e3 to really fortify this d5 pawn. And so now, one downside to this, my opponent does have a possibility of pushing here, targeting this pawn, and I'd have to defend that in some way. And that's the recommended move here by white, is queen to b3, and then they recommend that I counterattack, move my queen up here, so the queens are facing off against one another. But in the game, we have bishop to f4, so my opponent also getting his bishop outside the pawn chain because he plans to push his pawn to e3, and that would have blocked it in. So I continue pushing up to e6. Computer says that's an excellent move, but they actually recommend capturing the c pawn here. D takes c4. So now we have kind of a symmetrical position, except for this c pawn for white is pushed forward ahead of its knight, whereas my knight is kind of blocked in, so I'd have to move my knight here. And so the game continues with bishop developing, the best move in the position. And now we have capture, which the computer does not recommend that. It says that's still good, but knight to e5 would have been better. So if we look at that, if the knight would have jumped forward here, that's a possibility. You could maybe move your bishop back and then push this f pawn. So the game continues with capture, queen recaptures, and now the game's pretty even. White only has a 0.14 slight edge, and now the best move, according to the computer, is to attack the queen. So driving my queen back here to c7. Now, it looks like the computer recommended queen to e7, which would line up on the opponent's king. So, that's a possibility. So now we have bishop developing, and attacking my bishop. It looks like the best thing to do is go ahead and capture. And now the game's about dead even. Maybe black even has a slight edge. So after recapture, it looks like the game's pretty much even. The top recommended move is to push here and start attacking. But I go with, I think, the third best move, which is to just castle. Oh no, I developed my knight first. All right, so I developed the knight. Now we have castling. And then, what's left to do? Just find a place to put our rooks, which I want to put one here on e8 to be able to push my e-pawn. So a common move for white, you push your, or put your rook behind the pawn that you've pushed forward. So rook to e8. Now my opponent places his rook on the e file in case we have a fight in the future along the e file if things open up. So I immediately start pressing forward here. And it looks like this is the best move. Black has a slight edge here now. So the best move, it looks like, oh wow, is e4. To ignore this pawn, but, well, not completely, because you don't want to let this pawn push up to e4 and fork the queen and the knight. But it looks like e4 would have been best, pushing that pawn forward. But instead we have capture, and I capture. And so here, black has a little bit of extra space in the center with his d5 pawn versus white's e3 pawn. And so black has just a slight edge here, and my queen is a little more centralized. So here, I figured that my opponent wanted to double his rooks up on the e file and try and push this pawn. So I go ahead and play knight to e4. The computer actually recommends dropping the knight back to d7, which, I mean, I guess that would target this pawn, threaten to capture, and then attack the queen. But the opponent could always just press forward here. Okay, instead I launch my knight forward, but then now the game is almost even again. So after capture, which is best, queen capture, we trade the queens off the board, and with this, black has just a slight edge, but the best move is played, driving my rook back. And here, interestingly enough, the computer recommends moving the rook to the side, either to a4 or even b4. But instead, I drop back here, and with this move, computer claims it's still an excellent move. They're about the same. Black has just a slight edge. All right, the king moves up, trying to get into the endgame, which is always a wise choice. As pieces come off the board, the king can definitely make a difference in the endgame battle. All right. Doubling rooks on the half open file, that's usually a good tactic here. So my opponent does likewise, helping to defend this e3 pawn. I push this pawn forward to prevent him from pressing his pawn and attacking. So the game continues. And at this point, it's about even, just a slight edge for black. An attack. So I go ahead and defend. It looks like the best move instead would have been rook to f8. That's interesting. I mean, it would line, if you have a rook on the f file, it would kind of line up on the king. All right, so capture, and check here. So I block an inaccuracy. Now white has a slight edge. Apparently king to f7 would have been a better move, keeping both rooks on the board. And so my opponent drops back. That way if I capture, he can recapture with check. So I push this rook forward, thinking, and the computer says it's a good move, but it would have been better to immediately capture. I figure now if my opponent captures, I can capture. If the other rook checks, I can block, and it just helps me bring my king forward, which is kind of what ended up happening in the game. So, we get down to the end game, and one good piece of advice that I read, I don't recall which chess master said this, was do not go into an all-pawn endgame unless you're absolutely sure that you can win or draw and that you're not going to end up losing, because a lot of times these all-pawn endgames are way more complicated than they look. And it probably would have been better to keep rooks on the board. Although in this position, the computer says that it's dead even. So we play on here. We have king moving forward, which is, definitely something you want to do. The threat would be to come up here, and I step forward, and this is an inaccuracy. Apparently, it would have been better to go to f6. So, I guess we could take a look at that. And let's see what it wanted for my opponent. Instead of this move, b3, just pressing a pawn forward. But here, they like king to f7 or f6. So if I go to f6, I was kind of worried about, if you have king to f4, am I going to run out of moves here? Which I guess I wouldn't, because the king cannot go this way, and I can just move back and forth here, keeping the king out of the position. So luckily my pawns are in a good position here to keep the opponent from pressing forward. And I guess if the pawns push, we would just trade off, and I can keep the opponent's king away. All right, let's see what actually happened in the game. We had this position. My opponent checks, the best move in the position. I drop, slide over to the side. So my opponent starts pushing pawns, and I run out of moves. But luckily, it's still dead even. I can just move my king back. My opponent tries to get into my position, but my pawn is preventing him from going here, and my king prevents him from going forward. So I just move back and forth until he has no more pawn moves except for this one, but then that would trap him, and that would be really bad. So he definitely doesn't want to go here, or his king would be trapped, and he would have to make a losing pawn move. So he does step back, and I try to press forward, but same thing. We can't make any headway. So we just agreed to a draw here. And what I wanted to look at is if I check out the game review here. Let's see. Take a look at this. The game was pretty much dead even the whole way through. Let me make sure my image is not covering this. Okay. So you can see above my image, we both had 97% accuracy. So it looks like Frank played at 97%. I played at 97.3. Bad moves. Frank only had 1 inaccuracy and I had 2. So outstanding play from my opponent. Good job, Frank. And the computer, if I'll move my image for this, let me slide it up. You can see it looks like, according to the computer estimate, we both played at a 2500 level. Now obviously neither one of us are grandmasters, but that'd be nice to be able to play at grandmaster level more often with a 2500 estimated rating in that game. And it looks like in the opening, Frank played with 95.3% accuracy. I played 95.6. And then middle game, Frank played 96.5. I played 97.5. And then in the end game, great job by Frank with 98% accuracy and I played 97.9. So I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting game. It was more strategic. There wasn't a lot of tactics, so that makes it easier to score a high accuracy percentage like that. But interesting game nonetheless. So, if you have any comments, feel free to leave comments. I always love hearing from viewers and subscribers, and I try to respond to everybody if I can. So also like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.